March 16th, 1945, Stuttgart. By 2:11 hours, the sirens had already fallen silent. The sound didn't fade, it collapsed, as if the machinery itself was exhausted. In the sudden stillness, the city seemed to hold its breath. Snowmelt dripped from broken gutters. A single tram bell rang where its driver had abandoned it earlier in the night. For civilians in the shelters beneath Kernerstrasse, that silence carried more weight than the alarms ever had. It meant one thing: the bombers were close enough that warning no longer mattered. Reports later called it predictable. The people living it called it something else. Some named it the dead minute, others the second warning, because silence was more terrifying than sound. A woman near the entrance, Frau Kalb, whispered, "It's when the sirens stop that you hear your own heart." The phrase appears again in post-raid interviews, suggesting it was a shared instinct, the stripping away of external noise until the only remaining signal was internal fear. Outside, the ground vibrated faintly, not from explosions but from the weight of thousands of feet, neighbors, families and volunteers still rushing toward shelter, even though the window had closed. According to civil defense records, more people entered shelters after the sirens stopped than during the alert. Panic always lagged warning. A diary recovered from a ruined apartment on Hauptstädter Straße contained a single line: "The sirens are mercy, the silence is judgment." That night, the silence lasted 6 minutes. Then the sky opened. But Section 1 is not about the bombs. It is about the human moment before impact, the pocket of time when civilians attempted to negotiate with their own fear. One boy, age 12, pressed his ear to the shelter wall as if listening to approaching footsteps. His mother pulled him back and whispered, "Don't listen, it doesn't change anything." Psychological notes from Allied interrogations confirm similar behaviors across Germany, using physical contact with the environment to predict danger. The wall became a primitive seismograph for people who had no instruments left to trust. Stuttgart's civil defense commander, Oberst Rubeck, filed a terse line in his log after the raid: "Morale adequate, fear unavoidable." Military language could flatten anything, but inside the shelter, fear had shape. A middle-aged bookseller asked whether the silence meant the bombers had turned back. An elderly man replied, "If they turned back, the sirens would return. They don't return." He spoke like he had lived through too many raids to hope incorrectly. Most civilians developed what analysts later called tactical fatalism, accepting outcomes before they arrived, to reduce emotional impact. By 2:14, a youth volunteer entered the shelter shaking. His bicycle had crashed in the dark after the sirens ended. When asked what he had seen outside, he answered with a sentence that intelligence officers highlighted in their assessments: "The streetlights flickered like they were afraid too." Anthropomorphism under stress. A predictable coping mechanism, but still striking in its clarity. The stairway groaned overhead, the sound of another family forcing their way inside. A baby cried. Someone shushed too harshly. The air smelled of damp wool, coal dust and candle wax melting faster than it should. At 2:15, the pressure in the room changed. It felt like the air drew inward. One woman gasped and said, "They're above us." She wasn't wrong. RAF Pathfinders had just made their final approach, altitude 17,000 feet, speed consistent with a marking run. But the civilians didn't know numbers, they only knew sensation. Extract from Civil Defense Shelter 43B statement: "When the sirens stop, you start counting your memories, not your minutes." Paragraphs of official reports call this phase pre-impact mental sorting, the human instinct to organize one's past before the future arrives. It appears in testimony across Cologne, Hamburg, Berlin, Munich and Kassel, a universal psychological signature. By 2:16, the first flares ignited above the northern district, quiet at first, drifting, almost beautiful. But below ground, the civilians remained frozen. They could sense light even without seeing it. A young factory worker murmured, "It means they chose us." Her phrasing reflected a common misinterpretation, that flares were deliberate acts of personal targeting, rather than navigational tools. The silence began to fracture, tiny tremors, distant cracks, not explosions, not yet. These were the sounds of Stuttgart reacting, shutters slamming, doors bolting, metal frames cooling unevenly, as the temperature shifted in the night sky. Civilians often mistook environmental sounds for incoming bombs, accelerating their panic cycles. Extract from Police Post 7 telephone log. Citizens report hearing engines. Confirmed, no engines over central sector at this time. Fear created its own air force, and then, just before the first detonation, something remarkable occurred in Shelter 43B. Someone laughed. A short, sharp, involuntary sound, not humor. Release. A psychological valve giving way under pressure. Several survivors later described it as the exact moment they realized they were alive right now and might not be in 10 seconds. At 2:17, the first bomb fell, but the section ends one breath earlier, in the moment when civilians stood suspended between fear and acceptance, listening to the quiet that felt louder than war itself. According to Allied air staff files, Stuttgart was never the primary objective for the night of March 16, 1945. The briefing at RAF Granston Lodge listed it as Objective C, a secondary target assigned only if cloud cover over the RA remained impenetrable. Yet war rarely obeys its own hierarchies. By 1940 hours, meteorological updates forced a shift. Winds over Essen exceeded safe dispersal thresholds. Command logic pivoted. Stuttgart inherited the raid. None of this mattered to the people in Shelter 43B, but it mattered deeply to the bomber crews above them. A navigator aboard Lancaster LM 632 wrote, "We were ordered south. Decision made in 10 minutes. Civilians won't understand why." He wasn't wrong. The brutal geometry of strategic bombing rarely aligned with the emotional reality below. From the German side, the orders were clearer: maintain civil morale. Prevent shelter panic. This directive, issued by Reich Air Protection leadership in January 1945, was less an instruction and more an admission. They knew morale was already eroding. A separate report from Württemberg District Headquarters noted, civilians trust the sirens more than they trust the party. Fear can become a form of truth. By early March, German radio propaganda shifted tone. The broadcasts avoided promising victory. Instead, they framed the bombings as tests of national endurance. It was psychological triage, treating morale like a failing organ and hoping pride could replace oxygen. But civilians caught beneath the raids heard something different, the sound of leadership running out of words. Strategically, the RAF aimed to disrupt transportation and industrial repair zones. The flares dropped over Stuttgart that night, marked rail yards, not residential quarters. But pathfinder drift, crosswinds and urban sprawl blurred those intentions. As Bomber Command analysts later wrote, precision is a belief, not a guarantee. The flares that civilians interpreted as choosing them were simply artifacts of weather and mathematics. Extract from Air Ministry Directive, Nummercode 189, Objective: induce cumulative paralysis in target city functions. Secondary outcome: morale degradation. Note the phrasing. Civilians were never the explicit target, but their fear was an acceptable consequence within the doctrine. Inside the shelters, the rules were equally precise. Each facility had posted instructions: no speaking unless necessary, no lights above candle strength, no opening doors once sealed, no crying from children. Mothers were told to muffle them with coats if needed. Theory rarely survives contact with reality. In Shelter 43B, people spoke constantly. By 2:18, just after the first bomb struck the southern quarter, the shelter warden attempted to enforce silence. It didn't work. Civilians asked questions no rulebook could answer. Why did the sirens stop so quickly? Do they know we're still awake? Is this the big one? Will the Americans come too? Fear made civilians imagine coordination where there was only chaos. On the surface, German fire brigades scrambled. They received no predictive data, only the order: stand by. Expect heavy load. Their trucks hadn't been refueled fully in weeks. Rubber shortages, fuel rationing, and damaged hydrants meant many units were symbolic more than functional. Firefighters understood this. One commander wrote, "We wait with axes for a storm made of iron." Meanwhile, Luftwaffe night fighters were grounded near Ekterdenkirchen due to engine shortages. They heard the bombers overhead, but could do nothing. Their commander recorded, "We are witnesses, not participants." It was the closest thing to confession the Luftwaffe put on paper that month. Below ground, civilians sensed the absence of defense. That perception bred its own kind of fear. The understanding that the sky above was uncontested. A factory foreman whispered, "If we don't hear our fighters, it means they abandoned us." No one corrected him. According to Allied psychological warfare analysts, the most damaging emotional moment in any raid was not the explosion but the realization of isolation. The population understood, in silence, that help would not arrive. The orders on both sides emphasized coordination, planning, intention. But civilians rarely experienced war through intention. They experienced it through consequence. German leadership instructed civilians to remain steadfast. RAF command instructed aircrews to ensure maximum concentration. Reality instructed everyone to endure the hours until dawn. Extract from Stuttgart District Memo. 44B. Maintain discipline. Civilians must trust the system. But in Shelter 43B, at 2:20 hours, as dust sifted from the ceiling and the candles bent with the shifting air pressure, a young teacher whispered what no directive could prevent. "The system is up there. We're down here." It was the quietest rebellion in the entire war, the whispered acknowledgement that fear belonged to the people who had to live beneath decisions rather than make them. Strategic logic framed the night. Civilian instinct defined it. By 2:21 hours, the rhythm of the raid began to change. Early impacts were scattered, incidental, almost hesitant, but soon the bomb pattern tightened. The sound shifted from isolated thumps to a rolling pressure, like distant thunder that refused to fade. Civilians in Shelter 43B recognized the difference instinctively. Human beings learn the language of danger quickly. The shelter's concrete walls vibrated in long, slow pulses. Dust drifted in visible sheets. Someone counted under their breath, not seconds but intervals between impacts. A form of emotional arithmetic. Survivors later described it as the moment they understood the raid would not be brief or merciful. At 2:23, a strange phenomenon occurred. Every candle flame in the shelter bent sideways at the same angle. Several women gasped. A man crossed himself. The warden, trying to maintain authority, claimed it was only a draft. It wasn't. The bending flame meant a massive volume of air had just displaced above ground. A cluster detonation large enough to push a shockwave through the earth. Psychological warfare analysts later classified this reaction as anticipatory dread, fear triggered not by sight or sound, but by altered physical reality. Civilians were not imagining the danger, their bodies felt it before their minds could interpret it. Extract from Stuttgart Firewatch Log 02. Window frames on Olgastrasse blew inward at 2:23. Cause pressure front preceding main load. The civilians did not know the term pressure front, but they knew its effect. At the back of the shelter, a teenage boy insisted the raid would end soon. His father disagreed. "No, when the silence stops, they don't turn back." It echoed the sentiment heard across dozens of shelters. Silence meant approach, impact meant commitment, and sustained impact meant annihilation. By 2:25, the smell in the shelter changed. A faint metallic tang, like heated rail tracks. It drifted through the ventilation slits. Someone whispered, "Is that fire?" Not yet. It was the air reacting to rapid temperature changes above. Photo flash charges had ignited in the sky, heating pockets of atmosphere in bursts. Survivors often misinterpreted this as the smell of burning metal or distant flames. Their fear filled in the gaps. Outside, the first major fire began in the warehouse district. RAF photo reconnaissance later documented a line of ignition stretching across nearly 400 meters. But in Shelter 43B, the civilians sensed only fragments, a sudden, almost living warmth passing through the concrete. A mother pressed her hand against the wall. "It's hot," she said. The wall was not actually hot. Her phrasing, however, was accurate in a psychological sense. Fear radiates. At 2:27, a louder series of detonations shook the northern sector. The shelter's ceiling groaned. Children began crying in bursts rather than wails. Adults tried to quiet them with promises, but the words were thin. People were no longer speaking to reassure others. They were speaking to reaffirm themselves. A factory worker muttered, "They're cutting the city in half." His statement was not strategic, it was metaphorical. Yet later analysis showed it matched the bombing grid almost exactly. Fear and accuracy often coexist. Another man began reciting street names, tracing the impacts in his imagination: Nordbahnhof, Schwabstrasse, Rosenberg. It sounded like prayer disguised as geography. At 2:29, the shelter lights flickered. Several candles went out at once. This triggered the most primal reaction of the night. A collective inhale, a frozen moment, then panic breaking through the cracks. Not the lights. Not now. Please no. Civilians feared darkness more than fire. Fire is seen, darkness is imagined. Extract from Psychological Warfare Branch Report, 1946. During nocturnal bombardment, loss of light produced higher recorded panic spikes than proximate explosions. The warden lit new candles with trembling hands. He tried to sound calm but failed. Fear had begun to climb the walls like humidity. At 2:30, the shelter's steel door shuddered violently as a blast wave struck the street above. The hinges screamed. Dust rained down. For one terrifying moment, several people believed the roof was collapsing. A woman fainted. A man vomited. The silence that followed was worse. The tense, paralyzed silence of people waiting to see if they were still alive. When the next impact didn't come immediately, someone whispered, "They're moving away," but another voice countered, "No, they're correcting their aim." This was the discovery phase, not of bombs, not of fire, but of pattern. Civilians began to realize the raid was not chaotic. It was systematic, mathematical, deliberate. Understanding this brought no comfort. It only deepened the fear. Extract from Basement Testimony, Archive File 743. You could hear the rhythm change. You could tell when they found their mark. By 2:32, civilians sensed something else, a shift in the air pressure so subtle that only those closest to the door noticed it. A woman said, "It feels like they're above us again." She was right. The Pathfinders had completed their marking run. The main force was lining up. The last line civilians heard before the true storm began came from an elderly tailor, sitting with his hands folded neatly in his lap. "This is no longer a night raid, this is a decision." He didn't mean military decision, he meant fate. By 2:33 hours, the raid crossed an invisible threshold. What had been terror became duration, and duration is what breaks people. The civilians in shelter 43 bed no longer flinched at every impact. Their bodies had absorbed too many. Instead, they braced with each new vibration, as if timing their fear to the rhythm of falling steel. Above them, the main RAF bomber stream released its load. The city did not shake, it lurched. A roar swelled through the earth like a buried storm. The shelter walls flexed. The candles snapped sideways and guttered. Someone screamed, someone prayed. A father wrapped both arms around his children and pressed them into the corner, repeating their names as if repetition could anchor reality. At 2:34, a direct hit landed less than 2 blocks away. The shockwave cracked plaster from the ceiling. A heavy chunk broke loose and slammed onto the floor. Several people jumped back. One man cried out, convinced shrapnel had breached the shelter, though nothing had. The psychological fracture, however, was real. Extract from Civil Protection Report NOMA 77. At this point, civilians begin to exhibit dissociation, perceiving danger in forms not physically present. Fear had become its own weapon. Outside, entire rows of houses folded inward like collapsing bookshelves. Blast waves raced through empty streets, shattering windows not from impact but from pressure alone. Fire leapt from building to building, skipping courtyards as if guided by instinct. But the people underground heard only the translation of destruction, the boom, the rumble, the shifting earth. At 2:36, a new sound filtered through the ventilation shafts, a low, hungry roar. People recognized it instantly. Fire. A mother pressed her ear to the wall and whispered, "It's breathing." Her phrasing was irrational but correct. Fire at scale behaves like a living organism, expanding, consuming, inhaling oxygen through the same cracks humans use to survive. A young man stood and moved toward the door, as if intending to flee upward. The warden grabbed him. "You go up there, you'll cook alive." The sentence was brutal. It was also true. The bombs continued. High explosives followed by incendiaries, a deliberate sequence designed to tear open structures and then fill them with flame. Civilians didn't know the terminology, but they understood the effect. Each new detonation felt closer, heavier, more purposeful. At 2:38, the shelter plunged into partial darkness again. 2 candles went out in a sudden rush of air. Someone shrieked. Panic rippled through the chamber in an uncontrollable wave. A man shouted, "Stop, breathe, we're safe in here." But his voice cracked midway, betraying a truth everyone already understood. No place in the city was truly safe. Extract from Fire Brigade Radio, 238. Unable to reach Hustig Fertile. Streets blocked by debris. Advise all units, withdraw until blast phase ends. The firefighters were retreating. Civilians did not know this, but they sensed it. Humans recognize abandonment even without information. By 2:39, the air inside the shelter warmed unnaturally, not dangerously, but perceptibly. A woman whispered, "It feels like someone closed the world." In a way, they had. The bombs had reshaped the environment, turning the city into a sealed crucible. Then came the moment survivors spoke of most often. At 2:40, a bomb detonated so close that the shockwave passed through the floor like a physical fist. Several people were thrown off benches. A child hit the wall. The steel door rang like a struck bell. One of the support beams groaned. Deeply, slowly, as if deciding whether to fail, a man shouted, "Cover your heads, cover your heads." Two women dropped to their knees. Dust burned in everyone's nostrils. For several seconds there was only the booming heartbeat of the earth itself, slamming again and again, closer and closer, until the impacts blurred into one continuous concussion. Pain flickered through people's ears. Teeth rattled. Someone sobbed uncontrollably. And then, silence. Not safety, not peace. A sudden, terrifying absence of sound. 7 seconds long. Long enough for every person in the shelter to wonder if they had lost their hearing, or if the bombers had simply corrected their aim for one final perfect strike. A woman whispered, "Are we dead?" No one answered. Then the next wave hit. At 2:41 an incendiary cluster landed nearby. Through the narrow ventilation grates, civilians heard a sound like rain, but wrong, sharp, hissing, hungry. It was magnesium burning. Flames outside climbed walls as easily as climbing rope. The roar grew, deep and predatory. The shelter grew hotter. People instinctively leaned away from the walls. One man pressed his hand against the concrete, yelped, and recoiled. The wall wasn't searing, but it was warm, and warmth, in a bomb shelter, equaled death in waiting. Extract from post-raid debrief. Survivor 14. I thought the ground would open. I thought fire would swallow us. I thought that's how it ended. At 2:42, several people began praying aloud. Lutheran, Catholic, whispered, rushed. Others sat in perfect silence. A few dissociated completely, staring at the floor as if the danger were happening to someone else. Crisis blurs distinctions. Fear becomes communal. Time becomes elastic. The city above them was burning. The sky above that was still dropping fire. And in the deepest, most human part of their minds, the civilians of Stuttgart realized something that no propaganda, no directive, and no command could prevent. They were no longer surviving a raid. They were surviving each second. By 2:47 hours, the bombardment began to thin, not stop. Thin. The explosions spaced farther apart. The shock waves softened from physical blows to distant rumbles. Experienced civilians understood this phase immediately. It was not relief. It was warning. When the bombs slow down, it means the fires are taking over. Inside shelter 43B, the air tasted of limestone, smoke, and something metallic. The flavor of fear drying on the tongue. People shifted on the benches, every movement stiff. Hours of adrenaline had hardened their bodies. No one spoke above a whisper. At 2:49, the shelter door rattled with a new sound. Not blast, not debris. Wind, hot wind. A woman backed away from the door and said, "The fire is pulling." She was correct. Firestorms create their own weather, drawing oxygen toward their core like a lung inhaling. Extract from Weather Office File 17T, thermal lift observed reaching 1,000 meters. Updraft consistent with large-scale conflagration. The civilians did not need measurements. They felt the world expanding and shrinking at the same time. By 2:51, the candles fluttered violently. A child screamed when one flame elongated, as if stretching toward the ventilation slits. A man rushed forward and shielded it with his coat. His hands shook. Even tiny actions felt monumental, like nudging the universe toward mercy. Above them, parts of Stuttgart had turned into a single sheet of fire, continuous, unbroken, wide as streets and tall as roofs. Fire brigades tried advancing, but stopped when their boots began sticking to softened asphalt. Extract from fire brigade debrief. Hoses melted, hydrants ruptured, pressure zero. We withdrew. The civilians sensed the abandonment without needing words. A middle-aged clerk murmured, "No one is coming." The silence that followed confirmed it. At 2:54 the impacts returned, scattered, wandering, as late stragglers in the bomber stream dropped their loads. One explosion struck close enough to shower the shelter corridor with dust. A baby choked. A mother slapped her own cheeks to stay awake. Exhaustion was now as dangerous as flame. By 2:56, the interior temperature rose again. Not dangerously, but unnervingly. The concrete radiated warmth. People instinctively leaned into the center of the room. Fear teaches geometry. A teenager whispered, "If the roof gives way, we'll suffocate." No one contradicted him. They all knew it was possible. Then came the shift, the sound that separated the raid from its aftermath. At 2:58, the bombs stopped. Completely. No distant rumble, no fading echo. Just a sudden clinical stillness. The civilians did not celebrate. They did not move. They waited. 1 minute, 2, 3, waiting for the sound they feared, more than impact collapsing structures. At 3:01, it began. A series of heavy, pulsing thuds rolled through the ground, buildings failing, one by one, weakened by fire and blast. The shelter vibrated gently. Dust trickled like pale snow. A child asked if it was raining inside. A woman answered honestly, yes. The smell of smoke intensified. Thick, animal-like, it curled through the ventilation shafts in slow pulses. Civilians covered their noses with scarves and coats, but the smoke wasn't choking, not yet. It was simply the reminder that the city above them had changed shape. Extract from British reconnaissance memo, March 17. Glow visible from 120 kilometers. Southern grid square fully illuminated by fire. At 3:05, the warden made the first attempt to stand. His legs buckled. Fear makes even leadership fragile. When he finally steadied himself, he addressed the shelter with forced authority. "We wait until the air clears. We don't open the door until breathing outside feels possible. But how does one measure possibility in a city on fire?" At 3:08, an elderly woman began quietly describing her house, the window curtains she had sewn, the teacup she left unwashed, the creak in the floorboards her husband always meant to fix, a soft, trembling obituary for a home she knew no longer existed. Others followed. People spoke not of survival, but of loss, instinctively preparing themselves for what they would see after dawn. Clothing, shops, streets, everything familiar turned to memory in real time. At 3:11, the firestorm reached its peak. Civilians inside shelter 43B heard a continuous roar deeper than thunder. One man whispered, "It sounds like the ocean." Another replied, "No, the ocean gives back." No one laughed. The line was too true. By 3:13, the first collapse near their block struck hard enough to make several people shout and clutch the benches. The sound rolled downward through the earth, a heavy terminal groan. When the dust settled, a teenager asked, "Was that our street?" No one knew. No one wanted to guess. At 3:15, the air pressure began to normalize. The candles steadied. The roaring softened to a distant smothered crackle. Above, the fires still consumed, but their hunger was no longer infinite. Inside the shelter, a fragile realization emerged, spoken by a quiet, exhausted voice in the corner. "We didn't die, but something did. Something in the city. Something in them." Survival had consequences. Silence had consequences. And when the sirens stopped, people discovered that the fear didn't stop with them. By 3:23 hours, the firestorm's voice faded into a long, distant breathing. Steady, exhausted, almost human. The civilians in shelter 43B remained seated, still, suspended in the same posture they had held during the raid. No one stood. No one rushed the door. Survival, they realized, comes with its own paralysis. The warden finally reached for the steel latch. His fingers hovered over it without touching. The metal was warm, warmer than it should have been. He hesitated, not from fear of fire, but from fear of reality. Behind that door lay a city changed beyond recognition. When he finally pulled the latch, It clicked softly, almost apologetically. He pushed. The door moved only a few inches before stopping against something heavy. Debris. Just enough space remained for the air to enter. Thick, gritty, chemical, and alive. Several civilians coughed. A woman whispered, "We're still inside a grave." The warden closed the door again. "We wait," he said. Extract from Stuttgart Civil Record, March 17, 1945. Shelter occupants advised to delay exit until air toxicity reduced. Estimated safe time, approximately 1 hour after cessation of major fire activity. An hour, to civilians, time had become elastic. Sometimes seconds felt like years, sometimes years collapsed into seconds. An hour was manageable. They settled again. Quiet now, not fearful, emptied. At 3:31, a middle-aged man spoke for the first time since the raid began. He said, "When the sirens stopped, I thought it meant the end. I didn't know it meant the beginning." No one responded, but several nodded. That was the hidden truth of March 16th. The fear inside the silence did more lasting damage than the bombs themselves. During the raid, people had imagined impact. After the raid, they imagined absence, home, family, streets, shops. The small architecture of normal life burned into speculation. Psychology records from the period are clear. Humans fear not just death, but the unmaking of the familiar. At 3:40, someone finally asked the question that had been hanging since the first explosion. How much of the city is left? But reflection rarely brings answers, only clarity about the questions. Across Germany after major raids, civilians reported the same phenomenon, the inability to imagine the world above ground until they saw it. Shelters created a sensory coffin, sound without sight, fear without context. Emerging was not escape, it was rebirth into a harsher reality. Extract from post-war psychological study, file R219. Civilians consistently reported the moment after the raid, before exiting shelters, as the most introspective period of the war. At 3:48, the warden opened the door again, wider this time. Smoke drifted inward lazily. The air was breathable, barely. One by one, the civilians stood, legs trembling, eyes blurred, chests tight from stale air and anticipation. They looked like survivors in the oldest sense of the word, not triumphant, not grateful, not victorious, simply continuing. As they stepped into the corridor, their footsteps crunched on dust, plaster, and fragments of brick pushed in by the blast. A little girl asked, "Where's the street?" Her mother replied, "It's still there, somewhere." Psychological warfare analysts later wrote that emerging from shelters produced a unique cognitive effect, the shock of scale. Inside, danger feels personal. Outside, destruction feels infinite. The civilians climbed slowly over rubble blocking the stairwell. When they reached the surface, at last, dawn was beginning. A dim, ashen light filtered through smoke columns rising like ghosts. Houses stood half-skinned, roofs lay folded over like broken wings. Trams rested on their sides like felled animals. A man surveyed the ruins and whispered, "Nothing made a sound like this, not even the bombs." He didn't mean noise, he meant meaning. For many, the silence after the raid became the defining memory, deeper, sharper, and more unforgettable than the explosions. Because silence carried truth. It left no room for denial, propaganda, or hope. A woman clutched a charred doorframe and murmured, "When the sirens stopped, we learned what fear really is." And she was right. The bombs had struck the city, but the silence had struck the people. In the end, fear was not the product of sound but the absence of it. The moment when civilians realized that war's logic operated above them, indifferent and unanswerable. And when the sirens stopped, they discovered that survival demands its own kind of courage to emerge, to look, and to understand.